people want to take their seats. I'm just really introducing Harry Shiva-Satyasilan, who's one of our clinical research fellows based at the UCL Dementia Research Centre, finishing up actually a PhD looking at how people with PPA and FTD process vocal signals. But today he's giving a very general introductory talk about PPA. So the most important thing for those of you that are new is, first of all, please feel welcomed, because this is very very welcome and very nice to see you all here. But also feel free to ask questions of Harry and us, both at this talk and also over the course of the day, because that's the whole point, really, is to give you a chance to ask questions that you were too afraid or might not have had an opportunity to ask before about PPA. No matter how basic you think it is, please do feel free to discuss, because this is the forum to do it. So, Harry.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to Chris for asking me to do this talk. It's great to see some new faces and also some familiar ones as well. So, as Jason mentioned, this talk is primarily aimed at people for whom this is the first time that you've come to our meeting, but of course it's always really good, I think, for people who've been here before to see things again. Some of you who may have come to the talk I did at the last meeting will notice that this is really quite similar. But the real aim of it is to briefly, in about 10 to 15 minutes, go over what exactly PPA is and some of the characteristics of the different PPA syndromes. And the reason for doing this is because we know that people come to this meeting from a whole range of different backgrounds and experience based on people they may have spoken to or things they may have read. And so it can be quite useful for us to start quite basic so that we all have a similar base knowledge that we can use for the rest of today in any discussions you have further regarding PPA. So, quite ironically, for a condition that affects language and communication, there are a whole range of different terms and acronyms that are used in the field of PPA. And this is a huge source of confusion, not only for people who have the conditions themselves, but their families and carers, and also health professionals, doctors, nurses, speech and language therapists, and even those involved in research in the field. So I'm going to spend quite a large chunk of the time just going through what some of these terms mean and how they kind of fit together. I'm going to start off really broadly with the term dementia. So dementia is something that everyone's heard of, but it's a word that's often quite misunderstood, and a lot of people tend to think of it as a single condition or a single diagnosis. They will say that they know someone who's been diagnosed with dementia. But in reality, dementia is a really broad term that includes a whole range of different conditions. But the thing that they have in common is that they involve a progressive decline in one or more aspects of our thinking or cognition. So this can involve things like memory, or language, of course, but also other aspects like problem solving and reasoning, or even aspects of our personality and behaviour. And the underlying problem that seems to occur in nearly all these dementias is that we have a protein that is normally found in all of us and serves an important function in how we normally work, that seems to go wrong. And it's for reasons that we don't often know. When this protein goes wrong, it tends to accumulate in the cells in the brain, what we call neurons. And when they accumulate, they have a toxic effect, causing those cells to die. And the different dementias are often caused by a different protein that's gone wrong. In some cases, actually, the same protein can go wrong in different ways and cause different dementias. And when lots of these brain cells, these neurons, die, we can see this as a shrinkage of the brain, or what we would call atrophy. If you look at that middle panel there's two brains from people who had passed away. The brain on the right is from someone who had a dementia, and the brain on the left is from someone who didn't have the dementia. And what you can see is the one on the right is not only smaller, but those kind of creases and crevices in the brain have opened up and seem deeper. Now the thing is, in life, we can't really look at someone's brain without taking off the top of their skull. Unfortunately, we don't need to do that because we can use MRI scans. So that panel at the bottom right shows 2 MRI scans. And it might be quite difficult to orient yourself, but if you think of taking a slice right down the middle of me like this, and then looking in from this side, that's what we're seeing in those scans. And the one on the left is from someone who doesn't have dementia, and the one on the right is from someone who does. And similar to that picture, those pictures of the brains, you can see that those creases, those kind of crevices in the brain, have opened up. There is more black space on that right-hand picture compared to the left. So dementia really is a descriptive term, and it's really broad. It's a universal term, really, for this whole range of conditions. And I kind of thought, conceptually, to help us try and get an idea of how the different terms come together, we can think of dementia as a universe. And a universe consists of lots of different planets. And one planet, or one group of conditions within dementia on the whole, is FTD, or frontotemporal dementia. So this is a group of dementias within that larger group of dementia as a whole that are characterized by that shrinkage, that atrophy, in 2 main areas of the brain. As you can probably guess from the name, frontotemporal dementia, it affects the frontal lobe, which is that area in red there, and the temporal lobe, which is the area in kind of teal. So again, it's a descriptive term for a group of dementias that affect just the frontal and the temporal lobe. So returning to my analogy, I told you that we can think of frontotemporal dementia as a planet. Well, we can divide that planet up into continents. And one of those continents, so one of those groups of conditions within frontotemporal dementia, is PPA, or primary progressive aphasia. So what is PPA? Well, the best way to kind of get an idea of it is to break it down into the 3 constituent words. So aphasia is a disorder or a problem in the brain that results in a difficulty with communication. So commonly we think of this as speaking, but it also involves understanding of language and also aspects of reading and writing. The progressive element refers to the fact, as with all dementias, the condition changes over time. This may result in a worsening or deterioration of communication skills, but can also involve developing different problems in other areas of thinking and cognition. So, for example, developing problems in your memory or changes in your personality or behavior. And that primary part refers to the fact that partly the main initial problem is that of communication, or some aspect of communication, but also due to the fact that these conditions are not caused by some external factor, like an infection or a head injury. Now, PPA is itself not a single condition. So, returning to the analogy again, if we think of PPA as a continent, we can break that continent up into countries. And we can think of each of those countries as the individual PPA syndrome, of which there are 3 main ones: Semantic variant PPA, or SV PPA, Nonfluent variant PPA, so the NFV PPA, and Logopenic variant PPA, LV PPA. And I'm going to spend the rest of the time just going through some of the characteristics of these 3 different conditions. So starting off with Semantic variant PPA, also known as semantic dementia. Here, the real key problem that people have is that they lose the meaning of words and objects and concepts. It's a condition that affects our, as the name suggests, semantic memory. So our semantic memory is the store of knowledge that we have about words and objects and people. It's different to the kind of memory about what you did last summer or what you had for dinner yesterday. That's the kind of memory that we typically think being affected in Alzheimer's disease. But here it's more our knowledge of what things mean. This is sometimes referred to as a fluent aphasia, and that's because, at least in the early stages of the condition, the speech may sometimes sound normal. So the words are pronounced in a normal manner, the sentences and grammar are often correct, but you may find that people have a slightly reduced vocabulary, and they may have a tendency to talk around topics rather than getting directly to the topic. Kind of classically, this will present as someone asking the meaning of a word or thing that they would have previously known. For example, going to a restaurant, looking at a menu, and having to ask your partner, what is broccoli? Something that previously you would have known, but the knowledge of what that thing, what that word is, has gone. We find that in the earlier stages of the condition, sometimes the most specialized knowledge and vocabulary that we have may be affected. So, for example, previously in clinic, a patient was seen who was a very keen botanist, and he found that the first difficulty he had was he could no longer name flowers, something that previously would have come quite naturally to him. In clinic, we sometimes test this, and those of you who've been either to our clinic or perhaps others may notice this picture. And what we would do usually, we would ask people to identify what these different objects are. And what you might find is, for example, if you look on the middle row on the left-hand side, there's a picture of an owl. In the earlier stages of semantic dementia, someone might say bird, and maybe not be able to tell you much more. As things become a bit more advanced, they might be able to tell you it's an animal or that it's a living thing. And then even later on, they might just describe it as a thing and maybe not be able to give you more detail about it. So it starts with a kind of more generalizing of the vocabulary. I mentioned it being a fluent form of aphasia, and this is also seen in when people read. So when people read, it can sound quite fluent, but they might have a bit of difficulty with irregular words. So for those who don't have semantic variant PPA, when you look at these words, you fairly quickly realize what they mean and what they are, and therefore you know how to pronounce them. So you know that the top word would be island, then deny, and then so. But you might imagine that if you didn't know what the word meant, or what it was, you might try and pronounce it using rules we use more widely in the English language. So island might become island, deny might become denny, and so might become sue. This is something that we call surface dyslexia, and it's a feature that we see sometimes in semantic variant PPA. We've been mainly talking about this being a problem of the knowledge of meaning of words, but we know that over time it can affect your knowledge of non-verbal information. So, for example, people with semantic variant PPA may have a difficulty recognizing familiar faces, and instead would rely on another distinguishing feature to recognize someone. So, for example, if they're wearing glasses or they've got a beard. Another feature that we notice is, even in quite advanced stages of the condition, people have retained knowledge of numbers, and in fact can often get great pleasure from doing number puzzles like Sudoku. We sometimes find people use the fact that they have this retained knowledge of numbers to actually help structure some of their language. So, for example, if I were to ask someone how they got here today, they may tell me they woke up at 7:15 in the morning, took the number 81 bus, it took 45 minutes, they then took the lift up to the 6th floor and sat on the second row. So using these numbers to help structure their language, something that we call numerical scaffolding. So moving on to the second of the PPA syndromes, non-fluent variant PPA, or NFV PPA. This is also known sometimes as progressive non-fluent aphasia, shortened to PNFA. Here, as the name kind of suggests, the difficulty is really getting the words out, actually producing or pronouncing them. People often know what they want to say, but it takes a lot of effort to try and get those words out, and it results in quite slow and quite hesitant speech. There's a real difficulty in coordinating the lips and the tongue and all those muscles that are needed to form speech. And this can sometimes result in what we call quite misshapen speech, so speech that sounds quite odd. And it's something that we would call speech apraxia. We can sometimes test for this a little bit more in clinic by asking people to make other certain movements with their lips and their tongue. So, for example, asking them to yawn, to whistle, or to cough. Someone with non-fluent variant PPA might find this quite difficult and would have a tendency to say the word yawn or cough rather than actually perform the action. And this is giving us more evidence that the problem is really in coordinating these movements. It's something that we called orofacial apraxia. We've been talking about problems with words, but actually the condition extends out to how we put the words together. So in this condition, there can often be a difficulty with grammar and sentence structure. And this isn't only in spoken language, this is also seen in written language. And sometimes actually that can be an early feature. So, for example, people may notice that the emails they're sending out are not quite grammatically what they used to be. Unlike the semantic variant PPA, here understanding of individual words tends to be, at least in the earlier stages, largely intact. But longer sentences, or ones that are a bit more grammatically complex, might be harder to follow. So Chris and other people who work with me at the Dementia Research Centre know that as a new dad, it doesn't take much of an excuse for me to show up photos or videos of my daughter. So this is her in the early stages of developing her language.
Mama? No. Mama? Mama? Ma.
So, as much as I'd like to think she's just telling me who her favourite parent is, in reality, she just spends a lot of time saying the opposite of what she means. And I kind of shoehorn this in to really bring up another problem that occurs in actually several types of PPA, but particularly the non-fluent variant. And this is where people will say the opposite of what they mean when answering a question that only has two options. So the most common form here is a question that maybe has a yes or no response. The person may say yes when they mean no, or vice versa. And they may be able to correct themselves, but it can still often lead to quite a bit of confusion. And I remember a patient I saw in clinic, their partner got in contact with me because she was having great difficulty working out if he was in pain. He looked like he was, but when she would ask him, he would often say no. But what she was really showing is actually using other cues, so for example body language, can sometimes be a way to overcome some of the communication difficulty that this can cause. Moving on to the third form, the logopenic variant PPA, or LVPPA, also known as logopenic progressive aphasia, or LPA. Here the real difficulty is in finding the word. So people will often find that while talking, they have to pause because they're searching for the word. They can't remember almost what they wanted to say next. Sometimes this will result in words being mispronounced, so syllables being added in or missed out, or the wrong syllable being selected. For example, saying papple instead of apple. And in some cases, not as common, we might sometimes see that a word is replaced with an entirely different non-word or jargon term. So, for example, a patient was seen in our clinic who would quite consistently call a rabbit a kilb. Now, we don't exactly know why this occurs, but we think it's probably something to do with the way in which our brain is trying to select out the individual sounds that make up a word. Spelling is often a significant difficulty in logopenic variant PPA, and can sometimes be an earlier feature. The kind of characteristic and core feature of this condition, and one that we often try and test for when we see people in clinic, is a relative difficulty in repeating long sentences or words with lots of syllables compared to short sentences, or those that only have one or two syllables. So, for example, it might be relatively easier to repeat the word city than it is to repeat the word citizenship. And this reflects the fact that the key problem in this condition is that of verbal working memory. So it's the ability to hold that verbal information in your head as you're using it. And the fact that we have the difficulty with memory is in part due to the fact that in nearly all cases, or most cases of this condition, the underlying protein that has gone wrong is the same protein that goes wrong in Alzheimer's disease. And that's why you may sometimes see this condition referred to as the language variant of Alzheimer's disease. So if you return to my analogy, we have to make a slight correction. I previously said that all the PPAs belong on this planet FTD, but in reality, logopenic variant PPA belongs on planet Alzheimer, because it's really a form of Alzheimer's disease in which language is the leading problem. And this just reflects the fact that these different syndromes that I'm describing to you are very much descriptive. They basically tell us certain clusters of symptoms and problems that seem to come together. They don't always tell us exactly what's going wrong in the brain. And that is still, in some ways, a bit of a gap in our knowledge. So understanding how the problem in the protein translates directly to the problem the person experiences. And it's something that we here and in other places, people are trying to do research on to get a better idea. So that, as I mentioned, was quite a whistle-stop tour, just, as I said, as a brief introduction to what PPA is and what the PPA syndromes are. Really, as I said, aimed at people who perhaps have not been to one of these groups before. But I think we have time for a few questions. I think I should probably mention that this bit is being live-streamed, so people will be able to watch this at home who couldn't make it here. So if there are any questions that are a bit more personal to you, or you want to discuss things about your own kind of situation, then myself and Jason will be around at least for most of the day, so we're happy to have discussions. Yeah, we'll do.
Sorry.
Hi. I'm not sure, well, I'm thinking of our personal circumstances about the three. It seems all three are applicable. Does one happen first, then the next? Or how does that work?
So that's a really good point. So, as I was mentioning at the end, because these are really descriptive terms, so they're clusters that we often see, it does mean that they don't fit everyone. And that's because I'm not describing what the underlying biology in the brain is. We're describing really patterns. And so we often find there are people who will tell us that they might have features of a bit of both, or they might find that they start off looking like one and maybe changing over time. It does make the classification difficult. And I've outlined three kind of large syndromes here, but we know that within them there's a lot of variation and a lot of subtypes. So it isn't always the case, but in many cases, people will find that they don't fit neatly into one of these groups.
Hello. Does an early diagnosis make any difference to the eventual outcome?
So the hope is it will. So this is kind of in two parts. So early diagnosis can often mean that people haven't spent a long time with the uncertainty of not knowing what it is, which is actually often can be quite distressing. It also allows people to engage in kind of services that might be relevant to them. So, as everyone knows, the main topic of today is speech and language therapy, and I'm sure they would agree that there is a lot that can be done for people at all stages, but the early stage is a really big opportunity. Looking further in the future, we don't have curative treatments for these conditions, but we do know that when people develop these medications, they're most likely going to be most effective in the early stages of the conditions. And that's because it's very, very difficult to undo damage that may have already occurred, but it might be possible to stop further damage occurring. So yes, early diagnosis is definitely important.
Could the team suggest anything that's available to help with mental exercise for the cared for?
Yeah. So that's often a question people ask us about whether kind of brain training or kind of exercises would be useful or not. And I think our speech and language therapists today will be talking a little bit about things that are specifically useful within language difficulties. On the whole, the difficulty always, we know it's a condition that progresses over time, but I think we always say there is absolutely no harm as long as it's not causing too much distress. We're trying to do something that's clearly quite difficult or beyond your capabilities. But there aren't specific ones that I can recommend, but I do know that our speech and language therapists will be talking about things that will be more relevant.
In the introductory speeches, I've been to about 3 or 4 of them, and you don't mention choking or swallowing with any of the PPAs in the introductory speech. Is that because that all happens later after diagnosis?
It not always, but it is highly relevant. It is an important feature, and actually for future we probably should mention it. It does. It's typically not seen in the very early stages of the condition. It's usually seen further along, and it's a little bit more prevalent in certain forms of PPA than others. But you are completely correct. It's a really important feature, and it's something that when we see people in clinic, we often will ask about, and we'll often suggest an early referral to a speech and language therapist if there's any concern So not only from the communication perspective, but also from swallowing difficulties. Yeah. So as Jason was mentioning, part of the swallowing difficulty is also a difficulty with other motor changes, so changes in your movements or your use of your hands and use of your legs. This kind of, as Jason was mentioning, this Parkinsonism. So not Parkinson's disease, but features that sometimes look a little bit like it. And this is a feature that can sometimes develop in certain forms of PPA.
We understand that people can have had the condition for several years, recognised, unbeknown to anyone, until it's actually becomes visible, becomes worse, and then is diagnosed. And this seems to be the information we've got. It's quite common to have had the condition for several years. So therefore, that makes me wonder about how an early diagnosis is possible.
No, it is a great difficulty with early diagnosis, and part of that is awareness. So because these are rare conditions, a lot of medical professionals, so doctors you may go and see, may not even necessarily know about the condition. They may have never seen someone who has it. So part of what we try to do as well is to increase awareness of it, so that hopefully people can recognise changes early. But it is a challenge with it being a rare condition, making sure that everyone kind of thinks about it, so that if you do go to your GP with early features, that at least it's on their radar as a possibility.
Can I just ask, when did the term first come in? When was that as a stated diagnosis? I'm just wondering. It's rare, so I'm wondering, did it come on late?
Do you mean PPA generally?
Yeah.
I actually have no idea. I don't know. 1982. Yeah, please jump in.
So sorry to jump in, but this is very important. So the condition's been around for probably forever, and there are descriptions in the early modern era, and certainly into the 19th century, often by French or German neurologists who really made the running, of things that clearly were PPA, and sometimes they got very close to really describing it the same sorts of ways that we do. But that term, it kind of went into a bit of an abeyance in the early years of the 20th century for various reasons, and in particular in the British literature, because there was the 19th century neurologists who often read German and French were onto this, and then everyone sort of forgot about it, more or less, for 50 or 60 years. And then two people, so one was Elizabeth Warrington at UCL, who kind of essentially rediscovered semantic dementia, and the term semantic dementia was a few years later, so the early 80s, it was actually coined by John Hodges and his group. And then the sort of the term progressive aphasia was really popularised by Marcel Mesulin from Chicago, who wrote a very influential paper, one of the most influential papers in neurology, I think, where he described what he called progressive aphasia without dementia in 82. So that was kind of, and since then it's just grown. Well, you can see it's grown exponentially in terms of our kind of awareness of it. But the terms remain, as Harry was saying, a major source of difficulty, and that also goes for historically trying to work out what exactly someone was describing when they called something, whatever they might have called it. Working out whether they really meant what we would now call PPA. And so there's a lot of issues around the communication of the terms.
I did. Yeah.
That's it. We are around for the day, so if there are any other kind of individual questions, please do grab us. All right, in that case, thank you. I think there's a short coffee break now till 11. Great, thank you.
and Philip Robinson, who are sitting over here in the front row, who had a real vision to put an emphasis on speech and language therapy as people who, as I'll explain to you, have a very big stake in this and really worked indefatigably to get all of this together. And I think this is really, I hope they will feel a sort of a testament to all their hard work and their vision. And I wanted to just close by, as I hand over to Anna, by embarrassing Anna. So some of you know Anna Faulkner. So she is a rare bird. I don't know, am I allowed to say that in the current climate? This is being recorded. But she's a rare bird. She is a very specialist speech and language therapist with a particular interest in PPA, of which there are very few in this country, unfortunately, and we hope that Anna will be one of the people who will change that. She's now working with us regularly in the clinic, and this is a tremendous asset to our clinic. But the other reason that she's a rare bird is because she is an academic speech and language therapist, just completing a PhD in PPA, who brings the kind of academic focus to the condition as well as her clinical expertise. So in some ways, she's an ideal person to be talking to you today. So I think what I'll do at that point is get off and hand over to Anna.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you everybody here for coming. So before we get started, I'm actually just going to go through some housekeeping. So we've had a really great introduction to the team, but what we'll do is I'm just going to ask the team members to stand up in the room. So Claire, Chris has stood up here, Roberta stood up here, Nikki stood up here, Claire's at the back there, Olivia's at the back there in the black top, and Jason, of course, is here as well. So if anybody wants to speak to any member of the team, that's what they all look like. That's what we all look like. So please approach us throughout the day today. I'm also going to ask Eva to come up, who wanted to say a word about the National Brain Appeal. So I'll hand over to them.
Hello, hi, my name is Eva Tate and I'm the Major Appeals Manager at the National Brain Appeal, which is the charity that supports the Rare Dementia Support Fund. Over the past 3 years, the National Brain Appeal have raised $150,000 to provide the current levels of support, but we are looking to extend this. So this year we're raising 250, next year 300, and the year after our target's 350 to expand the service in the areas of education, support and research. We are also about to launch our latest capital appeal to raise funds necessary to establish the world's first centre for rare dementia support. So please do watch this space or come and talk to my colleague and I. Send me an email. We will keep you informed about all our progress for that. At the end of this month, we're holding a fundraising gala dinner called Mission Possible at the Cavalry and Guards Club, where the aim of the evening is to raise $100,000 towards the expansion. We have a silent auction for this with the most amazing selection of prizes, and we're going to send out an email with a link to that. So if anybody is interested in bidding or they know someone who might be, please feel free to forward that on and to take part if you'd like to. I'm also going to hand over to my colleague Alexis, who can tell you about a special marathon team that we have for RDS this year. Thanks very much.
Hello. Thank you for listening. So you might recognise a few of the people on this screen. We have a very special London Marathon team taking part this year. So we've got Chris Hardy and Anna Volkmer and Nikki Zimmerman and Seb Crutch. They're all going to be raising money for the new RDS Centre, which is really exciting, and they're all training very hard. It's a very big challenge. They do have a Just Giving page, so if anybody can spare a few pounds to sponsor them, they'd be really grateful. Training for a marathon is no easy task, so please do sponsor them if you can. We will be out there on the day cheering them on, so if anybody would like to come and join us, it's a great day out. You can get in touch with us. I'm going to be here at the lunch break, so just come over and say hello, and I can let you know where our cheer points will be and give you a little bit more information. That's great. I'll hand you over to Anna. So I have been for a run this morning in preparation. So the real housekeeping. Today we are live streaming the morning's talk. So just if anybody asks a question, which we'd love you to, just be aware that it's being live streamed. After lunch, we won't be live streaming, okay? So it's just the morning bit that will be live streamed. If you need the toilet, they're all signposted, but they're all, a lot of people may know this already, but they're all towards the back of the room, behind kind of where the coffees and teas are. If there is a fire, which there shouldn't be, but if you follow the green exit signs, and there'll be staff members guiding us all to exit the building, okay? So there's one other person who Roberta wanted to mention something about another thing to flag. Actually, as Roberta's walking up, I will also flag that there's a legal team here today who will be around at lunchtime if anybody, the UCL legal team, if anybody would like to have a chat with them about anything at all, they're here to give advice. And we also have a map up in the behind where the coats are. And what we're doing is we'd really love everybody here to put an arrow from where they've travelled from. So we get a real feeling of where everybody has come from today to attend this meeting. So I'm going to hand you over to Roberta for the last sign before we start.
Thank you, Anna. Just a moment to let everybody know, I coordinate all of the regional support groups around the UK for all of the rare dementias. We have a PPA support group that's been running in Hampshire for a number of years now. And unfortunately, our regional facilitators for that group, both of them are not able to continue with this group. So my question is, if there's anyone from around that area that is interested in taking this over, and we will provide you lots of support and help from RDS in London, please come and speak with me. We do want to keep it going. They, as I said, they have been going. There's only maybe 2 or 3 meetings a year, but it is very valuable. We have people coming from all over the place. It's based in Oddiham, which is down towards Basingstoke in Hampshire. But as I said, they get people who come in from a long distance. So if you are interested or know of anyone who might be interested in that, please come and see me. Thank you.
Right. Just one other flag that today everybody who's attending has a colour dot sticker on their badge. And the only reason we've put this on is we thought people might find it useful when they're networking and talking to people at lunch to find other people that they may have something in common with. That's all they're there for, okay? Just to give you an idea. And now we can get started with the main part of the day. So, welcome to today's meeting. We're going to talk today about keeping communication going with primary progressive aphasia and how speech and language therapy can help. And we're going to start that by hearing a little bit from Philip and Sharman Robinson, who've co-produced, so they've actually worked on the whole day with Rosemary and I. We're really grateful. They're going to tell a little bit about their experiences. Then myself and Rosemary are going to talk about what speech therapists do, especially about something called communication partner training. And then we'll talk about some strategies and have a bit of a lunch break. And then this afternoon, we're going to work in smaller groups. And I'll tell you a bit about that later again, but smaller groups around this big space as well. So let's get started, and I'll introduce you to Philip and Sharman.
Thanks, Anna. You're in the centre.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. We're both a bit nervous about presenting to so many people, so you'll have to bear with us if that's an issue. Who are we? Sharman worked as a special needs teacher specialising in children with dyslexia.
Yes, that's right. Sharman that's Philip, and he's an accountant.
Sharman was diagnosed at Queen Square with Logopenic PPA in 2016. So our experiences might not resonate with some of you who have different variants.
Then, when we started, it was here.
In 2016.
Yeah, that's right. That's when we started. And this one.
So why are we up here?
This is what we're trying to say.
Well, we believe speech therapy can help a lot of people with PPA to live a better life for longer. We want to encourage you to try it.
Yeah.
And we think that there are new ways of providing speech therapy for PPA being developed which can help reach out to us.
Yes.
In our case, understanding dyslexia made us want to get speech therapy because PPA is a speech disorder at the beginning.
Yeah.
We asked, and we got some speech therapy at Queen Square.
Yes.
And it was very helpful, but it was very infrequent.
Yes.
We tried to find a therapist nearby.
That's right. Yes.
But we could not find anyone who knew about PPA.
That's right.
So an internet search showed that increasing research into PPA and speech therapy was being done in Australia and the USA. But at that time, not much was being done over here in the UK. So we looked around the internet again, following references that we found in the research material, and discovered something called teletherapy. We realized that this approach, which is delivering speech therapy over the internet, meant that we could receive speech therapy from anywhere in the world. So we found a speech therapist in Australia.
Yes, we did.
But writing about PPA, she was writing about PPA at the time, but the time zones didn't work.
That's right.
So we had a look and found a speech therapist in the USA, in Philadelphia, and Sharman started weekly sessions in mid-2017
That's right.
over the internet. Over to you.
We met, we didn't have anything anywhere.
We didn't have to go anywhere.
We didn't have to go there, and then we had
read the words.
Met at
lunch in the
UK,
which was breakfast time in Philadelphia.
Yes, that's right.
The therapist had all the technology all ready, and her practice was using it to provide speech therapy treatment in the USA and in some places in Europe. It was quite easy to get started, and they simply sent us a link which gave us access.
That's right.
And I think these sorts of things are increasingly able to be done in the UK.
Yeah.
Sharman talked with her, and they practiced strategies.
Yeah.
You'll hear a bit about that from Anna and from Rosemary. And I think doing that helped Sharman become more confident about speaking.
Yeah, it's very good. I was finding it difficult and to answer questions, and sometimes I couldn't finish and had nothing to say, and so I got had to do a lot of practicing and writing and words.
We also did conversation partner training, which you're going to hear about from Rosemary in 2018 with Discover.
Yeah.
And we found this really helpful for both of us.
Yes.
And Rosemary's going to tell you all about that. We really thoroughly recommend that if it's possible to do it.
Yeah.
So what did we get out of speech therapy? Well, I think it restored Sharman's confidence.
It did. It did very well.
We both learned new strategies to communicate.
Yeah.
Both together, and also strategies that we could train families and friends to use, which meant that Sharman allowed Sharman to reconnect with both family and also friends that she disconnected with.
Yes.
And it made it possible for us to maintain participation in the wider community together and with Sharman's friends, so that she could keep on doing things that she'd always done.
Yeah.
And meeting others in group together, there are a number of friends here today, gave us a network of new friends to encourage one another. So
I felt that everything was lovely and normal, and we liked this.
Yeah, it helped us live
Yeah.
a nearly normal life.
Yeah, that's
We all
right.
know it can't be completely as it was before, but it helped
That's
us
right.
re-engage
That's right.
with society in a
Yes.
way we couldn't. The problem with PPA is it's a rare disease,
It is.
and the
It is
speech
indeed,
therapist
yes.
who has the skills may not be anywhere near the person who needs the therapy. Teletherapy, like we've had, is one way of overcoming distance and is increasingly available.
Yeah.
But another way is to have a central expert like Anna Volkmer, and for local therapists
Very nice.
to be able to get training and assistance from the central hub when they have clients who need it.
Yes. And I hope we can do from Queen Square. We will say something about that.
We've also been involved in a clinical trial for speech therapy run for people with PPA that's being run by Northwestern University in Chicago.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's on the internet.
Yeah, that's it.
We finished in November last year, and we found it really worthwhile, and we can retain access to the online resources that they made available
Yeah.
until the trial completes in 2022. I think increasingly trials in this area will start to happen in the UK as well.
Yeah.
But just to make the point, it didn't matter to us because we were on the internet.
That's right.
And I think that could apply to lots of people in this country. If you're living in Northumberland and your therapist happens to be in London, if you can find a way to do it, it works for us.
Yeah. And we just want to encourage you to help all of you, and we'll see how you can get on with it. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip and Sharman. That was absolutely wonderful to hear about your experiences. Thank you so much for sharing that with us here today, and well done. So what we thought would be helpful now is for me to talk a little bit about the breadth of what speech and language therapists do, because one of the things that people, both other health professionals and people living with PPA and their families often say to me is that they don't know what speech therapists do. So what can speech therapists do to help? What options are there? So what we thought would be helpful is to describe those to you a little bit, because speech therapists, first of all, you had a really fantastic and useful talk from Harry this morning, but what I tend to find as a clinician is that when people come to see me, they don't come to me and say, I have logopenic variant PPA. People tend to come to me and say, I just want to keep being able to do my job, or I love reading to my grandchildren. That's what I want to be able to do. Or I really want to go to the pub. I want to go to the shops. I want to go out and keep doing that. Other people just don't understand at all. What can I do? What can we do? Family members often say, what can we do? So husbands, like Philip in the past has said to me, I want to know what I can do to support my wife. Adult children say to me, I want to know what I can do to help my mother or my father. So often partners and family members and friends want to know what they should do to help as well. And I don't really like seeing other people because my speech is so bad. So people often start telling me that they don't actually enjoy communication or socializing as much as they used to because it's so tricky and so difficult. So what do speech and language therapists do? There's no one thing that works for everybody in terms of speech and language therapy. Everybody is quite different. We have quite a few different therapy approaches available. Everybody's conversation is different. The way we interact with people is different. And so different types of therapy might not always be everybody's cup of tea, okay? So it's really important for us to find out from the person what will work for them. So I'm going to tell you exactly the types of things that we know can work for people with PPA. And one of the first ones I'm going to describe, and some of you might know about this, is word practice. And sometimes people say to me, when I first meet them, that they've already tried a little bit of word practice. And what we know when with word practice is it's actually really important to plan word practice carefully. Harry this morning mentioned that the different types of PPA mean that people have different difficulties with different parts of words. So for some people, it might be really important to practice the words and their meanings. And for other people, it's more important to think about the sounds of the word. Okay? What we know is that people with PPA need to practice words that are meaningful to them. That's the most useful stuff. And by practicing these, for some people with PPA, we find you can maintain some of these words. I hope I'm not offending anybody with my football team choice, but I've chosen this just to explain this type of therapy. Script training is a really useful approach, not for every type of PPA, but we know particularly for non-fluent agrammatic variant and often some people with logopenic variant, that writing a script and practicing it automatizes the script, so to speak. It becomes more automatic if you practice it every single day. Like words, it's really important for a script to be personal. I'm from North London. This is my son's script, not mine. But it's got to be a script that's personal to that person has written themselves. And when we practice the script, there's a certain order in which it's really valuable to practice it. But there are other things which we know can be helpful. And for example, I talked at the beginning about people wanting to go out and continue things like shopping and going to do the things they love doing, going to the shops, cooking, seeing friends. And there's lots of strategies and tips and hints that we can suggest. And we know that for some people, for example, instead of making shopping lists with written words, perhaps using photos to make a shopping list, some people find that a really simple, useful tip. However, we're going to talk a bit more about conversation partner training today. So conversation, all the things I've described so far are really much more about the person. Conversational communication partner training is actually about working with the person and the people around them. We know that we don't talk to ourselves on our own very often. We don't stand in a room very often talking to ourselves. Generally, conversation is something that happens with other people there. And that's why it's really important to do this type of therapy with the other people in the conversation as well. And then there are other things that people find quite useful. And these are things that we know work for people with other types of communication difficulties as well. And I've just put a selection up there. We kind of call them communication aids as an umbrella term. But things like having a communication card, a wallet card, some people find that really helpful, that they can show people to explain what's happened to them, or maybe with some key phrases on it that they can practice. I used to work with a builder, and he used to list the things he wanted to buy in the kind of B&Q shop and rehearse them in the car park and walk in with it. Or communication books full of information about your whole life. And of course, I've mentioned phones when I talked about photos, I think. But phones and technology can be really useful. What's important to note here is that we're really apprehensive about people spending lots of money on technology. We would never recommend that. We always want people to actually talk to a speech therapist and problem solve what might be the most useful for you.
And sometimes, if a person's already using a phone, there might be bits and pieces on a phone that work better than some newfangled app that has been recently designed. So it's really important to work out what is best for the person. And of course, groups. It's all well and good speech and language therapists suggesting things to work that might work for conversation, and us saying, yes, you must use a communication card, but actually doing it is really tricky. So we find groups are a really useful place to practice conversation and share tips and hints. Because speech and language therapists don't have all the tips and hints. We know that there's often people have been living with things for many, many years, and actually other people might have more useful tips and hints to share with other people. So we want this help to be more widely available. And as Philip and Sharman mentioned, what we're trying to do is, one of the things we want to do is spread the word about this. So part of that is myself as a speech and language therapist, I am trying to spread the word within the profession. And I do work here at the National, providing some therapy, not only via face-to-face, but we're also trialling some teletherapy is the word that Philip used, so delivering therapy via Skype or FaceTime, so via the internet if people feel that's something they could use, and working with local therapists. The other thing we're doing is trying to tell other health professionals, trying to tell doctors, nurses, other therapists, GPs, neurologists, all those other health professionals you might come into contact with. And we've written this article with a group of speech therapists and neurologists from across England, so across the UK, America, and Australia, because we really want to shout from the rafters about the breadth of the role of speech therapy. And this is in a journal, a scientific journal that's targeted at doctors to really tell them what we're doing and what we can do. So I'm going to hand over now to Rosemary, but I think there was a moment in case anybody had one question. So after each of the talks, we're going to invite one question, and then we've got a bit more time at the end. Is there a question, a burning question? Yes?
The ages ago, UCL were developing some software for, and that might be applicable for PPA. Was developing some software that I think was for stroke people, but it was going to be trialled last October, and I don't know whether that ever took place.
That's a really good question. So there are groups of researchers at UCL developing some software, some apps, and I know Chris Hardy is involved with one of the projects, and as far as I know, they are still underway. Is that fair to say, Chris?
They're actually running focus groups at the moment with people with PPA, and there's details in the last newsletter if people are interested in taking part. Sorry, just to say, this is an app called, I think, I Read More, which is developed for people with stroke aphasia. They've asked us if we think it would be applicable for people with PPA, and so we put some details in the last PPA newsletter. And what they want to do is to run focus groups with people with PPA and friends and relatives of people with PPA to see if people think that it might be something that would be useful for people with PPA. So if you check through the last newsletter, there's details about how to get involved in there.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So we'll move on now to Rosemary and Townsend, who's going to speak a little bit about conversation partner training. Thank you, Rosemary.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for asking me to join this. Anna has done a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all the different ways in which speech and language therapists might work with people with PPA. I'm going to talk about conversation partner training because this is something which is an approach that I use particularly in my work with PPA. Just a bit of context, I lead a small charity in Surrey, that's where it is, called Discover. And for 25 years, we've been providing support to people with aphasia. And for the last 5 years, we've been providing specific support for people with progressive aphasia. Aphasia can also be the result of stroke. So our PPA groups have been running for the past 5 years, and it's lovely today to be able to see a lot of people here who've been part of those groups. Like Anna, I'm committed to reaching more people with PPA. I'm very keen that we share practices that we think help, and that's why I'm here today. We do outreach work as well, so although we're in Leatherhead, we're very open to the idea of working in other places too. And I'm very in support of Philip's view of teletherapy. Lots of possibilities. So let's just talk about what conversation partner training might look like. This is the fundamental. It is for people with aphasia and a partner together. So I often meet people who have had diagnosis of PPA, and I say, have you seen a speech therapist? And they say sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I might say to the family member, were you part of the session? And they'll often say, oh no, I sat outside, or I went out. I wasn't part of the session. Conversation partner training is for both of you, for people with aphasia and the partner together. The reason why is, as Anna's already said, we don't have conversations with ourselves. We have conversations with a partner. Sometimes more than one partner in a group, but there's usually one person who you have more conversations with in your average week. So again, sometimes people say, well, I don't qualify because I don't have a husband or wife. I can't do your course. Well, that's not the case, because we are happy to include people who are a daughter or a son or maybe a friend who can be that partner. So here are some examples of partners. We work across our service with helping train our volunteers, our staff, husbands and wives. And actually, we also train people who provide exciting things like golf lessons. I won't go into that. But they're all conversation partners. They all need the skills to be able to have good conversations with people who have aphasia. So the focus of our conversation partner training is on equipping the person, the partner, to support the person with PPA. The reason being that a good partner can get you a long way. It makes an enormous difference if you have a supportive partner. I don't mean emotionally supportive, although that's helpful, but I mean someone who understands how to support the person from a communication point of view. So it involves change for that person too. You're going to learn new things. And in our approach, the aim is to improve everyday conversation. We're not training people in a laboratory setting. We're about real life. We're talking about real conversations, the things that you want to talk about and you do talk about on a daily basis. So it's practical and real. There are a lot of benefits of better conversations as well. I always say conversation is a sort of glue that holds relationships together. So better relationships can result, less isolation, sense of being cut off if you're not having conversations. People can feel more involved in decision making as well. That's an important benefit of having better, more successful conversations. People can be involved and should be involved. And overall, a greater participation in life. We know that PPA often means that you have retained physical ability. A lot of people continue to do a lot of sport. There are lots of opportunities to be active and participate in activities. Conversation can often be a barrier. So better conversations can mean people can continue to engage in hobbies and interests. I think I've already mentioned that at Discover we deliver our conversation partner training in a group. So we have several couples who come along, up to 6 couples come along to a group, and that's really important to me. I wouldn't change it. There's good reasons for doing that. However, you might also have conversation partner training with just you as the couple with the speech therapist. So it comes in different shapes and sizes, and all I can do is explain what we do at Discover. So I'm going to just go through a few examples of what you might do. If you were to come along to one of the courses I run, for example, what would you actually do? Because I think people are quite hesitant, particularly if they're asked to come along and do something together. They think, what am I going to have to do? What's it going to be like? It sounds a bit threatening, perhaps. They're a bit worried. They want to know. And I would want to know too. So one of the basic things we start with is with some information about PPA and about language processing and about conversation, how we do these things, what our brains are doing when we're processing language. Often people don't understand why they can't find a word, or why sometimes they say yes when they mean no, or why they struggle to understand in a busy environment. So understanding a bit about the nature of language is a good starting point. We also feel it's important to step back. When you're looking at changing behaviours and patterns of conversation, which perhaps a lot of the people I meet have been married for 50 years, they've had, you've got established patterns of conversation, and it's something new to learn, to change things. So we do a bit of kind of stepping back and analysing of conversations. What's going well? What's not going so well in the conversation? So here's a picture of a couple looking at themselves on video. So we video a conversation and we look at what's working and what isn't working so well. Also, the process of learning something different takes time, and often you might want to watch someone else use a strategy to do something different. So you can sit back and watch and see what works and how you might follow that behaviour. So here we've got one of our speech therapists demonstrating how to support a conversation, and his wife and others are watching. I said it's important to work in groups. I can't underestimate this. Really, the support and fellowship and understanding that grow out of our groups is quite humbling. It's remarkable that people really find people who truly understand what it's like to be supporting someone with PPA. Whatever the variant, there are similarities that people find, common ground, and that's very useful in terms of resourcing people and increasing their resilience and ability to cope in the future. And there's a lot of problem solving that goes on. I don't have all the answers. Often someone else who has that lived experience will offer a suggestion, and that's a very helpful thing. So some of our course, when we meet, some of the session will be spent with family members together in conversation. We might spend time learning how to prepare for a conversation. Often if you dive into a discussion or a conversation, particularly if it's important and it's complicated, you might lose the attention or the understanding of the person who has PPA. It's much more helpful if you can come equipped. So we talk about preparing for conversation, bringing information, bringing written or picture information. And then crucially, you have to practice. We can all hear and understand about doing something, but you've got to practice it and learn how to use that strategy in different situations. And in fact, one of the things we find useful in our courses is we do a partner swap, which sounds a little bit inappropriate. It's not. We encourage husbands and wives to have a conversation with another person, not the person they've come with. That really does seem to help people get a grip of the strategies that they have learned. And also to talk about things which they don't already know about, because often people have been married a long time, have had a lot of conversations, and there's a lot of shared knowledge. So here, this example is a conversation about a trip up Mount Kilimanjaro. And there's the picture there, which I think is Philip's handiwork there, that picture. John's story, Philip's picture. So Philip was being the conversation partner to support the conversation and to learn more about a particularly exciting thing, the achievement that John had done. So everyone is different, and you need to practice the things that work for you. Another thing that the group format allows us to do is to practice small group conversation. A lot of people also say, well, when we have our friends round or our family round, it's just so difficult. The person with PPA has to, opt out and gets excluded. So this is an opportunity to have a group conversation, but with the participants all being very aware of what that person needs in order to join in. And plenty of as I said, the participants in our courses continue to socialise and meet after the course is finished. Practice at home also, trying to take away those points that people have learned and actually remember to use it at home in between the sessions is very helpful. What I didn't say is our courses are 6 weeks long, so we have 6 sessions long, but often we have a longer gap between sessions so people can go away and put those strategies into place. And we ask people to video themselves at home as well, so that they can learn and reflect on how they're doing. So finally, we obviously have we usually have a person with PPA coming with one partner. We did run a course where somebody came with their twin sons, grown-up sons, and partner, which is fine. But what we like is to be able that the person who's been the partner on the course can pass on what they've learnt to other people, so that they're not the only one who benefits, that perhaps they can go and speak to a son or a daughter or another relative to help those conversations run better too. And one of the things we do to that end is we encourage people to take a short video which they can show to other people as a sort of demo. So that's a short sort of description of how the conversation partner training works at Discover. I'll hand back to Anna now. Oh, sorry, I can answer a question.
Did anyone have any questions for Rosemary? There's Olivia.
Thank you.
Hi.
You're based in Leatherhead. Are there similar groups throughout the country, or do you run your charity and it's unique?
I would love to say there are similar groups throughout the country. There is only one of our charity is a local charity, and we have 2 groups we have a group in Kingston as well, but we're running our PPA service from Leatherhead, which is on the M25, nice and convenient. People do tend to come a long way, and it's really not how I think it should be, because we don't want people to be tired by the time they actually arrive. So I would love to see more people doing it, and that's why we're doing things like this. And Anna will.
Can I add
to
that answer?
Sure.
I'd also like to add that not everybody wants to join a group. Lots of people say to me, I've never been a joiner. Why would I start now? And actually, I think it's really important to say that this kind of therapy is something we do in individual therapy too. So even looking around this room, there are people who I have met and worked with on an individual basis to do this kind of work. And I know that often when I speak to therapists who are working more locally to people, this is one of the areas that we prioritise. We teach people, and we're developing more online resources. So Jason, Professor Warren mentioned that I have been doing some research, and part of my research has been developing free online materials for therapists to use, tailored to the needs of people with progressive aphasia. Okay, so we're really trying to equip the therapists across the country with easy to access materials to do this kind of work.
Any more?
Any other questions? Or should we probably wait to the end? One more question. We don't have the time.
Yes. I love French. Yeah.
You're a French speaker.
Yes.
Yes, I know. Yes.
Yes. And also, when I was younger, I like sport.
Yes.
Yes. It was footing, rugby, I played cricket. Yes.
That language is good.
Yes.
Yes, and when we work with people in our courses, we like to find out about them and their interests and their backgrounds. And in fact, this afternoon, there's an opportunity to have a conversation with other people, and we're going to be asking just those questions.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave that there for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that was a really important comment there, because conversation is an opportunity for us to share our interests, share what we enjoy, what we love, what we're passionate about, share our opinions on Brexit or not. I'm just trying to wake everybody up. Thank you so much, Rosemary. I really appreciate that. That was really useful. What we thought would be helpful for the last section of this morning before lunch, we thought it might be really useful for us to think about, what does conversation training look like? What are the actual strategies and behaviours that we are describing to you today? What are we asking people with progressive aphasia and their communication partners to do? So we've put some slides together to try and explain this. So what we want to do is get everybody, or ask everybody, to put themselves in the shoes of the other person. A lot of this therapy is about thinking about how what we say, both the person without PPA, both the partner and the person with PPA, how does that affect another person? And often thinking about what that person might be experiencing. Is the partner with is the person with PPA thinking, I want to talk, but this is so difficult and so frustrating, it's just too hard. But the other person might actually be feeling not really feeling that that's what's happening. They might be feeling something completely different, like, why are we not having a conversation? Why do I have to do so much? What's the point? And actually, I guess the point, the thing to remember here is that communication can become difficult, not just for the person with progressive aphasia, but for all the people around them, okay? And some of the strategies we might describe are things that I'm going to go through a couple here, and these one of those might be about the environment. It might not only be about what you say, but about where you say it. And we know this is important. We know this is important not only for progressive aphasia, but also for other people. We know that as we get older, it's really hard to drown out background noise. And we know from the research evidence that means it's harder to concentrate on what people are saying. We know that people with progressive aphasia sometimes have difficulties not only understanding words, but understanding sounds as well. So if there's lots of background noise going on, that can make it a lot harder. So I've often been to visit people in their homes, do therapy in their homes. I've often go into hospital wards, and people often have a radio on, the TV on, the dog barking, the grandchildren running around, and everyone's trying to talk on top of one another. And it can be really hard to understand what's happening. So probably one of the first things we suggest is if you want to have a conversation or an interaction, it's really valuable to try and get rid of background noise. And that might seem really obvious, but sometimes we all forget it. I certainly do. The other thing that people often say is that the way we talk and have conversations, it's not only that we sit down and have a chat, but we might, at home in particular, we might say to a family member or relative, say, oh, can you just go and pop to the post office and get me a chair and pass me a biro and then turn the telly on and then pass me that piece of paper. And we're doing chores around the house and we want to get things done. We haven't got time to dilly-dally. And so we throw lots of information at each other, okay? That's really hard for people with progressive aphasia to often not only understand, but also to process every single word in the right order, okay? So what can be really valuable is not giving quite so much information. It can become, you get lost. We all know that if we go and we talk to somebody and they're just talking at you, it can be really hard to keep track. So one of the really key recommendations we often make is perhaps giving information in smaller chunks. I know that's something that some of the partners here in the audience may have been to the carers group last week, and I know that Ida was talking about chunking information into smaller bits. Smaller bits of information are easier to work with. Not as overwhelming. We've missed a slide. Never mind, I will speak to this. Sometimes what happens, so this is the solution, but I wanted to show is that sometimes if a person with progressive aphasia uses the wrong word, it's tempting as a communication partner to give them the right word and to correct them because, you know, it's helpful. That might actually help them say the word correctly and it might help them get the word correctly. So what sometimes happens is that if somebody says, for example, pass me the pepper, the partner might say, no, you don't want the pepper, you mean sugar. Say sugar, say the word sugar. And it can be very tempting to try and ask the person with progressive aphasia to say the correct word, just for practice. A few people are smiling and laughing in the audience, and I think it's very tempting to do that. Actually, that kind of conversation is generally not something we do with our partners. We know the way I described that the way I kind of acted that out, if I said to somebody, can you say that for me? You say the word, repeat that after me. That's the kind of conversation we generally have with people when perhaps a teacher is talking to a student or a parent is talking to a child. And that can be really annoying if a partner says it to another partner, and we might not even notice we're doing it because actually it seems like a helpful thing to do. So what we would say is, rather than correcting someone, is one of the people I worked with once, she phrased it as checking. Instead of correcting, I like to check. So if somebody says, please pass me the pepper, rather than saying, no, not the pepper, you meant the sugar, you say, did you mean the sugar? So you're checking with them rather than correcting them or testing them. Does that make sense? And we know this out of all the things I've presented so far, this is perhaps one of the strategies we think is most important. And actually from the murmurs in the audience, I think perhaps people recognise this the most. And this is another example of that. So asking a question where you know the answer, kind of testing somebody, can be quite stressful. Some people say to me, well, it's a really good way of just starting a conversation, because otherwise I don't really know what to say, and we sit in silence. And actually, you know, I have to emphasize here that I've met lots of people for whom this is totally a normal way of communicating. And it's really important to stress that when we work on conversation and we make these suggestions, they're not for everybody at all. I met one couple in particular who I will always remember, and one of the partners was a head teacher, and she was the one who was she always used test questions with her husband, and she always had, and she always would do, and he liked that. That was the way they'd had their conversations for their entire lives, and that's okay. But what we know for some people, that's kind of what can happen when somebody has a communication difficulty, that it starts happening more often, that partners start testing people, saying, tell me, how many grandchildren have you got? Tell me, remember their names, say their names. What did we have for breakfast? Tell me the name of that food. Can you say it out loud? Can you say it louder? Can you say it to John as well? And then say it to Jemima. So you're really getting people to practice. And this could be quite stressful, as I said at the beginning. So one of the things we often suggest is that rather than asking people testing questions where there's a perfect answer, is asking people questions that we often describe as opinion questions. Questions where there is no right answer. So you can say, well, look at these photos. Which is your favourite photo? Which one do you like best? So I've got some example photos to help that discussion. And sometimes actually using materials like photos and written down words so that you can stimulate a conversation can be really helpful, okay? Rather than depending on somebody saying the exact right word, they can actually point or write down a word or draw something, as we saw earlier. So it's not, and I think that's perhaps a nice place to finish these strategies, is by saying when we talk about conversation, we don't just mean words, we also mean everything that goes with that. We mean the way we use our voice, the way we gesture, the way we... some people can really gesture and act things out. That's part of conversation. That's part of an interaction, an exchange. Some of you will know that, if you go to a foreign country and you don't know the language when you're on holiday, you can have an interaction with somebody just through pointing and gesturing. That's still an interaction, okay? And that's still an important experience. And with somebody who has a progressive aphasia, we can use not only their words, but also gestures, writing, pictures to support an interaction, okay? But it sometimes needs a bit of work to tune into that. And we're not saying this is easy, but that's why when Rosemary was describing the therapy we do, we know this takes practice. We don't expect to suggest these things and people to just be able to do them. This is something people need to practice. We need to practice. And even then, sometimes it doesn't always work perfectly, but it's just about having some more tools in your toolkit to help have a conversation. So that's the end of this morning's talks. Is there anybody... We've talked quite a lot, but we wanted to give you the time to have a listen this morning. Does anybody have any more questions for us? Philip?
Can I come and say one?
You can, absolutely. We'd love you to.
It does require practice, but it's really worth it. What happens when someone gets aphasia. For those of you that are in married relationships or partnered relationships, when you started, you were two separate people. You didn't know each other. And what happens is, when you get together, you build an overlapping circle. I wish I could draw this for you. And the center bit is your shared life. Now, what we experienced was, when Charmin got PPA, she kind of withdrew a bit into herself. She became slightly different in her approach to our relationship, not in terms of our lovingness, but in terms of how she could interact with me. And she couldn't really move. It's like she's got a broken leg. She can't run the marathon anymore, but I can change and I can move. And for me, that was the most important learning I got from conversation partner training. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, I want to encourage you to be persistent. We're sitting here today because I've been persistent. I'm going to say something about Jason. He is the most exceptional neurologist I've come across. But when I met him 3 years ago, and I talked to him about speech therapy, he said to me, I'm not sure about speech therapy because I've seen people who've taken it on and they've got very frustrated and I'm worried about their well-being. But I have to say, I have been persistent, and here we are sitting today talking about this because it's important. And that will be your experience with your GP. Most of them, you know more now than most healthcare professionals around the country about the role of speech therapy in PPA. And when you go forward, we want you to be equipped with the stuff, the resources, the slides here, to ask them to help you. And that's really what today is about. It's not about making you experts, it's about starting the journey.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Philip. So, I'm a convert. We aim to convert everyone. So we aim to convert you all. So this afternoon, what we're gonna, after the lunch break, at the lunch break, there's an opportunity for you all to relax, have some food, talk to one another, meet other people. We're gonna break into groups, and we want to give you the opportunity to practice. And what we're going to do, we're going to ask you to break into small groups. So we're inviting people who have primary progressive aphasia to break into groups with some of the speech therapists and student speech therapists who we've invited here today to help us. And I'm actually going to get them to stand up so you know what they look like and who to aim for. So we've got some speech therapists over there from Queen Square, and there's a couple behind them from also speech and language therapists, and there's some student speech and language therapists here from UCL, and they're going to be working with people with progressive aphasia in small groups, having a conversation, okay? So you're just going to be sitting and chatting, and they've brought lots of materials with them to support you to chat and talk about who you are and engage in some conversation, okay? We're going to ask people who are the communication partners if they'd like to come and talk to Rosemary and I in separate groups. Okay, so we're going to give you guys the opportunity to have groups for the people with primary progressive aphasia to talk. And then Rosemary and I are going to be sitting, myself here at the front, and Rosemary's going to be at the very back of the room. And we're going to be talking about communication strategies for conversation, and we're going to be here answering all your questions, okay? So, but you don't have to leave your partner or your family member or your friend that you came with. You can go together, that's absolutely fine, but it's just an opportunity for you to split into those groups and have a conversation or ask us some questions about conversation training, okay? So I'm just checking, there's nothing else I need to say, but we have managed to finish a little bit early. And if there's any questions or people want to come up and talk to us, then please do. Yes, there's a question there.
My question is simply, how do we access this therapy?
Speech and language therapy. That's a really good question. So at the end after the groups, we're all going to ask you to come back just for the final word. And we've got some handouts. where we've got information about how to contact Discover, where Rosemary Townsend works. We've got information and contact details for myself. So we provide, as I mentioned, my role is as a national, I provide speech therapy to anybody who can come to the national, and we're trying to deliver speech therapy via teletherapy. But I would always say the first port of call would be your local GP. And more, I know that this isn't there's a big postcode lottery across the UK in terms of what speech therapists can do. Often it's to do with what they're allowed to do. And many of them, I know somebody mentioned earlier, many of the speech therapists aren't resourced. They don't have the means to provide communication therapy. But more and more, these barriers are being knocked down. So I found that more and more therapy services are opening up their arms and offering speech therapy to people with primary progressive aphasia. And so I would always say, go to your GP and ask them to refer you to their local therapy team, speech therapy team. And I'm always happy to talk to that local therapy team and give them tips and hints, which I often do. But get in touch with us. We've got some handouts available for everybody, so we can problem solve with you to try and find what might suit you best. Okay? Jackie, I think Roberta's got a microphone. Is that all right? Oh, there's two coming. Thanks, Olivia.
Yes. How much can personality be affected by this condition? Because I have read and experienced to some extent that it can, and what can be done, if anything, to help it?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to answer it a little bit, and then I might defer to Jason. So I always say to people that we convey our personality often through our conversation and the way we communicate. So people who will say to me that they used to be the life and soul of the party, they used to be the chatterboxes, they used to be the jokers, and then when they've been diagnosed with primary progressive aphasia, that can change because they're not able to take on that role anymore. So, and the other thing to say is a lot of our conversational style is kind of made up, is part of what we interpret as personality. So we often have a certain style of interacting or communicating. Some people are very chatty, some people are less chatty, some people are very purposeful, and some people are more careful in the way they communicate. And a lot of that conveys what we often define as part of our personality. So communication changes can affect that. However, I'm going to defer to Jason to speak a little bit about more broadly about personality changes, if that's okay, since he's here, the expert.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. So it's also really difficult to give a single answer because what Anna and Rosemary and certainly Shaman and Philip have shown is how fundamental language is to kind of who we are and ourselves. And as soon as you start to affect that even slightly, you really radically change how we can interact with other people, which is a big part of how we express our personalities. So, for example, I've certainly had someone say to me in clinic that, the very first thing, because we're all about, what are the earliest signs, really, if we can find them, the earliest symptoms, was a loss of the ability to do small talk. Now, we tend to think that that's trivial. It's small talk. But, I mean, actually, this was it was profoundly disabling for this person because they'd been really very adept at it. But also, it turned out to be, the most sort of sensitive sign that there was something going wrong. And you wouldn't pick that up on, on any of the standards, certainly our kind of cognitive tests that we do. But beyond that, then there's a reaction to what's happening with language. So, for example, in people who unfortunately in some ways retain extremely good awareness of their difficulties. So, for example, in people with non-fluent PNFA, often frustration and depression and kind of the emotional reaction to that will often change that person's sort of personality style. Because personality really is just, our sum total of our style of interacting with the world at large. It's a very, very broad thing. And then in the case of sometimes, and particularly actually in people with semantic variant, there can be additional effects of the disease on personality structure and behaviour, fundamentally, which are completely separate from the effects on language. And again, I think Rosemary Anna have made the point very eloquently. We tend to forget just how much of our communication is actually non-verbal. And actually one of Harry's, and if you heard before, main interest is actually looking at what happens to non-verbal signal processing in the PPAs. So it isn't even just speech, and speech is such an integral thing for what it is to be a human, to be able to use speech. But it isn't even just that, it's also the effects on these other non-verbal functions. And those non-verbal functions are unfortunately, integrally hit as one of the features of semantic variant. So that's a complicated, long-winded answer to the question, but that's how complicated it is. And actually, I sort of think one of our missions is to try and show neurologists and psychiatrists how they have a real responsibility and a role in actually picking up some of these other functions. It isn't just about doing linguistic testing. It's also, we talk about holistic sort of assessment, but it's kind of trying to get a handle on what's going on in people's personalities and those other aspects of their behaviour, because without knowing about that, we won't be able to manage and advise them properly. So that's the long-winded answer.
Thank you so much. There's a couple more questions, but thank you.
I think this is a slightly connected question, but is it not working? Sorry, it's a slightly connected question, but I'm unclear quite how to phrase it.
That's
so,
okay.
So my mum has Logopenic PPA and Alzheimer's, and I'm not entirely clear of the connection between those two things. But when it comes to trying to communicate better, I am also unclear how much my mum is changing through Alzheimer's, and I wondered if there are strategies for dealing with those two things working in conjunction, and therefore, so I'm listening to other people who are finding ways to communicate, and I feel like they're reaching for the person they used to know or who is under there. I'm not clear, how this other disease or this connected disease is bringing about changes, and therefore when I'm trying to find ways to communicate, what other ways do I need to be adapting to find out who I am communicating with?
Thank you. So, Harry described this morning, talked a little bit at the beginning of the day, and not everybody was here because that's often the bit where the new people come. So some of you may have heard this already, and I'm going to try and use some of Harry's description because I think it's pretty useful. So Harry was kind of explaining that although there are these, we call these primary progressive aphasias, and there are these three different main groups that people tend to group into, what they're caused by is slightly different. So we know that logopenic variant of primary progressive aphasia, that is caused by an Alzheimer's. So the logopenic primary progressive aphasia is basically a description of your mum's symptoms. And the Alzheimer's is the cause. So they're the one and the same. Is that a fair nutshell? Would Harry or Chris or Jason like to add to that? And when we're talking about communication strategies, what we work on is the communication strategies, the communication difficulties that are happening in that person's life at that time. So one of the main principles we use is we actually, with a lot of people, is we try and encourage people to video record a conversation they're having. And we look at the video recordings to see exactly what are the barriers in your conversation. How is the logopenic variant primary progressive aphasia, how are those symptoms impacting on the conversation with you and your daughter or you and your partner? Because it will be different with different people. So the conversation that you might have with your mum might be different from the conversation that she has with another family relative. So we look at the barriers that happen in that particular conversation. So in some ways, whether we don't really look in depth at when we're looking at communication strategy, we don't necessarily choose them because you might have Alzheimer's or whatever. We choose them because they work for you. And we know that often people have been using strategies for many years because you've been living with this for many years. And you've been trying to tweak your conversation, your communication for years. And what we do is we try and harness those things that are going well and try and actually help you refine those. So we don't tend to, does that make sense? So it's a really personalised therapy that works for you personally. Yes, and Jason as well.
So, what it illustrates is how confusing this is. So the comments are a very, very useful thing for people to come out and admit that actually it's very confused. Alzheimer's and logopenic is one of the most difficult things. But the kind of interaction between them, so everything Anna said then is completely true, but the way the disease looks as it starts to go along is that, and in fact this is true of the PPAs in general, that they start to resemble one another eventually, because people will start to involve more of the language network. And so if you think of this whole big network of areas, it starts off here or here or here or here, and that looks very different. But as things go along, it tends to take on more and more of the features of the other syndrome. So eventually, people will have many of the same problems in common. So that kind of experience becomes more shared. And that's true also of the Alzheimer's situation in logopenic aphasia, because eventually people with the presentation with the language problems will have problems with their memory, problems with their spatial awareness, and some of the things that we think about as being features of Alzheimer's disease. So when you get managed, you go along, you see the neurologist and you ask for help with the management of that, the neurologist or the team have to kind of be also looking for those other things. And for example, we will, in that particular sort of PPA, we'll often use the tablets that we use for Alzheimer's disease. So obviously don't know about your personal situations, but that's one response to the fact that we think that the pathology in the brain, if you like, the actual, what's going on in the cells, is similar in Alzheimer's of these different varieties, whether or not you started with the logopenics or something else. So it's that kind of thing. The only thing just to say that is a slight, maybe useful for people just to think about as a sort of a slight comfort of how we think about what's happening, is that often, at least in my experience, the experience of many neurologists, the logopenic Alzheimer continuum, the awareness of kind of social and emotional things around people is often present for a very long time. So this is both a thing that means that, it's a way that people can kind of respond to other people around them, but it also means that when you communicate, we communicate, or people, family members and others communicate with people, it's very important to be sensitive to that, because people with logopenic aphasia and Alzheimer's disease, even though they may have a lot of problems with their cognitive function, will pick up often on emotional cues. So, for example, if someone is angry or sad or whatever it might be, they are often really remarkably good at picking up on those things for a very long time into the illness.
So I think we've probably got time for one more question before lunch. And I thought I saw somebody in the middle here earlier on, towards the back. Was there anybody who had a question?
Sorry, I just wanted you to elaborate a bit more on the non-verbal communication issues in Semantic PPA. I think you may have referred to that as in the last part.
So people with, we know in speech and language therapy that people who develop any kind of communication difficulty that affects their language, that it can affect aspects of their non-verbal communication, okay? Because sometimes non-verbal communication carries meaning as well. So in semantic variant primary progressive aphasia, where people experience difficulty in understanding the meaning of words and concepts, because they can't say them, they often also cannot use gesture to communicate them either. Sometimes gesture might be easier for longer, but it still may be tricky. If somebody doesn't know the meaning of the word of an idea, so if somebody doesn't know what tennis is and they don't know the word, then gesturing what tennis is may be also quite tricky. And I think the other thing to say, and Jason was starting to talk about how people change as they live with how the disease progresses. And we know from some of the work that Chris Hardy's been doing, he's been surveying people, asking people to feedback on how people experience changes, what the kind of stages are of the different variants of PPA. And we know that other aspects of communication, so non-verbal, and that includes things like using appropriate eye contact, standing close enough to a person, using appropriate volume, or taking a turn at the right time, not interrupting somebody, not hogging a conversation, and perhaps even saying the right thing, like judging that what's socially appropriate to say, using the right joke at the right time, not crossing our social barriers. These are all kind of social skills, and some of them are real non-verbal skills. And these can also become really difficult for people, particularly with semantic variant primary progressive aphasia as time goes on. Okay. But I'm conscious now, Roberta has given me a lovely non-verbal sign indicating that it's time to stop and we've got lunch and food. And we're going to have our lunch break now. And after lunch, as I said, we'll kind of usher you around to help you find the groups that suit you. Thank you very much.